I never expected to find something so small, so helpless, abandoned in the mud. It was just after dawn on my family's farm when I heard it, a desperate, high-pitched squeal cutting through the morning fog. So faint I almost missed it. The rain had been relentless for days. Fields flooded, fences damaged. I was trudging through ankle-deep mud to assess the damage when I heard that sound again. Weaker this time. I followed it to the far corner of our property where our land borders the industrial farm next door. There, half submerged in a muddy puddle and shivering violently, was the tiniest piglet I'd ever seen. No mother in sight. No siblings. Just this trembling pink body, barely bigger than my hand. "Hey there, little one," I whispered, kneeling in the mud. The piglet's eyes were barely open, crusted with dirt. Its breathing was shallow, irregular. When I reached toward it, it tried to squeal but could only manage a raspy gasp. It was barely breathing. If I didn't act fast, it wouldn't survive the night. I scooped the piglet into my jacket, feeling its cold body against my chest. Its heartbeat was rapid but weak, a frightened, fluttering pulse. Back at the house, I cleared a space on the kitchen counter, laid out towels, and gently placed the piglet down. What on earth is that? My wife Sarah stood in the doorway, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. I found him abandoned near the Marshall property line. Must have escaped their operation somehow. The piglet was smaller than I initially thought, probably only a day or two old. His skin was raw in places, and one of his back legs was twisted awkwardly. "Can you get me the heating pad? And maybe that box we used for the barn kittens last spring?" As Sarah gathered supplies, I carefully cleaned the mud from the piglet's face. He squealed, a sound so piercing it made my ears ring, yet so weak it broke my heart. Every touch seemed to cause him pain. His tiny hooves scraped frantically against the towel as he tried to escape. "Shh, it's okay," I murmured, knowing full well it wasn't. "I'm trying to help you." Once the box was ready with the heating pad set to low and covered with soft towels, I placed him inside. He immediately tried to burrow into the warmth, his little body still trembling. I dipped my finger in warm water and moistened his dry snout. He instinctively tried to suckle. "He needs milk," Sarah said, already reaching for her phone. "I'll call Dr. Myers." The piglet's eyes, now visible after I'd cleaned them, were a startling blue. They darted around fearfully, unable to focus. But when they briefly met mine, I felt something shift inside me. A responsibility. A connection. "I'll need to bottle feed him every 2 hours," I said, already knowing what this commitment would mean. Even through the night. Sarah looked at me, then at the piglet, then back at me. "You're giving him a name, aren't you?" I hadn't realized it yet, but I was already attached. "Wilbur," I said without thinking. "His name is Wilbur." It was cliché, naming a pig after the character from Charlotte's Web, but it felt right. This piglet needed someone to believe he was some pig worth saving. The first night was brutal. Dr. Myers had dropped off specialty formula and a tiny bottle with feeding instructions, but Wilbur refused to eat. He would take a few drops, then turn away, whimpering. At 2 a.m., after our third failed feeding attempt, I sat on the kitchen floor, cradling the box against my chest, fighting back tears of frustration. "Please," I whispered, "you have to eat." Wilbur's breathing had become more labored. His tiny body seemed to be giving up. In desperation, I lifted him out of the box and held him directly against my chest, under my shirt for warmth. I could feel his frantic heartbeat against my skin. "I'm not giving up on you," I promised. "But you can't give up either." I warmed the formula again and, keeping Wilbur against my chest with one hand, tried a different approach. Instead of the bottle, I dipped my pinky finger into the warm milk and brought it to his snout. To my amazement, he began to lick it. Hesitantly at first, then more eagerly. For the next hour, I fed him drop by drop on my fingertip. It was painstaking, but by dawn, he had consumed almost half the recommended amount. It wasn't enough, but it was something. As the sun rose, Wilbur slept soundly for the first time, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. I hadn't slept at all, but watching him find peace was worth every exhausted minute. The days blurred together. 2-hour feeding intervals meant sleep came in short, unsatisfying bursts. I moved a cot into the kitchen to be closer to Wilbur. Sarah brought me coffee and took shifts when she could, but the piglet seemed to respond best to me. By the end of the first week, Wilbur was drinking properly from the bottle. His twisted leg hadn't improved much, but Dr. Myers fashioned a tiny splint to help straighten it as he grew. "He's a fighter," she said during one of her checkups, "but you should prepare yourself. Even with the best care, runts like this often have underlying health issues we can't see." I nodded, but in my heart, I refused to accept that possibility. Wilbur had already survived against impossible odds. Who was I to doubt him now? As if sensing my thoughts, Wilbur squealed from his box. No longer the desperate cry of those first days, but an almost playful sound. When I peered in at him, he was on his back, tiny hooves kicking at the air. For the first time, I saw what might have been a piglet smile. By week 3, Wilbur had outgrown his box. His pale pink skin had darkened, and soft bristles were beginning to cover his body. The splint had been removed, and though he had a slight limp, he could now stand and take wobbling steps. We moved him to an enclosure in the mudroom. Bigger space, more toys, a specialized heat lamp. He greeted each morning with excited squeals when he heard my footsteps, standing on his hind legs against the enclosure wall, desperate for attention. I found myself talking to him constantly, telling him about my day, about farm chores, about anything and everything. He would cock his head to the side, ears perked forward as if understanding every word. "You know he's a pig, right?" Sarah teased one evening, finding me reading aloud from the newspaper to a very attentive Wilbur. "He likes the sports section," I defended with a smile, "especially when the Patriots are winning." But beneath our lighthearted banter, a question loomed. Wilbur was growing. Soon he would be too big for the house. What then? The industrial farm next door would never take him back, and I wouldn't send him there if they did. Our property wasn't equipped for raising pigs. And as much as I'd grown to love him, Wilbur deserved the company of his own kind, space to root and wallow, to be the pig he was meant to be. I pushed these thoughts away. For now, I told myself, just enjoy each day for now. At 2 months old, Wilbur had developed a distinct personality. He was curious, following me from room to room when allowed. He loved having his belly rubbed and would flop over dramatically whenever he wanted attention. He figured out how to open the lower kitchen cabinets and would rearrange the pots and pans if left unsupervised. He also loved music, an accidental discovery when I turned on the radio one morning. Certain songs would make him prance in circles, his little tail wagging frantically. Country music, oddly enough, was his favorite, but his growth brought challenges. Our floors weren't designed for hooves. Our furniture wasn't built to withstand curious piglet testing. And despite our best efforts at house training, accidents happened. Sarah and I began researching farm animal sanctuaries, places where Wilbur could live a full life, with proper care and companionship. We found 3 within driving distance and planned visits to each. I didn't tell Wilbur about these plans. Silly, I know. How do you explain to a pig that you love him too much to keep him? That the best thing for him might be saying goodbye? The morning we were to visit the first sanctuary, I found Wilbur unusually lethargic. He hadn't touched his breakfast. When I stroked his back, he didn't respond with his usual contented grunts. "Sarah," I called, panic rising in my throat. "Something's wrong with Wilbur." Dr. Myers arrived within the hour. Her examination was thorough, but her expression grew increasingly grim. "It could be several things," she said finally. "An infection, pneumonia, or possibly issues with his intestines. We need to get him to the clinic for tests." The ride to the animal hospital was tense. Wilbur lay in my lap, his breathing shallow. I kept one hand on his side, feeling each labored breath, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You'll be okay. We'll get through this. Just stay with me, buddy." The tests confirmed pneumonia, severe and fast-moving. The next 48 hours would be critical. Dr. Myers wanted to keep him overnight for observation and treatment. Leaving him there, in a sterile cage with tubes and monitors, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. His frightened eyes followed me as I walked to the door. I nearly turned back a dozen times. That night, our house felt eerily quiet without his snuffling and gentle grunting. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time the phone rang, my heart stopped, fearing the worst. The call came at dawn. He's responding to the antibiotics, Dr. Myers said, her voice cautiously optimistic. His fever's down. If you want to visit, I think it would do him good. I was in the car before she finished speaking. Wilbur's recovery was slower than his decline had been. Days of antibiotics, careful monitoring, and gentle encouragement as he regained his appetite and strength. When he finally came home, he was thinner, more subdued, but the spark in his eyes had returned. Our sanctuary visits were postponed, then rescheduled. Each time, something held me back. Wilbur needed more time to recover. The weather wasn't ideal for transportation. The sanctuaries had intake freezes due to other rescues. Excuses, all of them. The truth was simpler and harder to face. I wasn't ready to let him go. But as spring turned to summer, Wilbur grew exponentially. He now weighed nearly 60 pounds and had discovered the joy of mud puddles in our backyard. His favorite spot was under the apple tree, where he would root around for fallen fruit and take luxurious naps in the dappled shade. One evening, as I watched him contentedly exploring the yard, Sarah sat beside me on the porch steps. "We can't keep putting it off," she said gently. "Sunrise Sanctuary called today. They have space for him now." I nodded, throat tight. "I know. They have other pigs, acres of land, a pond, medical staff on site." "I know that too." She took my hand. "You saved his life. Now you have to give him the life he deserves." Wilbur chose that moment to trot over, nudging my knee with his snout, demanding scratches. As I obliged, feeling the coarse hair that had replaced his baby-soft fuzz, I knew Sarah was right. Love sometimes means letting go. The day we drove Wilbur to Sunrise Sanctuary was bright and clear. He traveled in a large crate in the back of our truck, periodically sticking his snout through the air holes to sniff the changing landscape. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, memorizing the sight of his curious face. The sanctuary was everything they had promised: rolling green pastures, mud wallows, sturdy shelters. As we pulled up, I saw other pigs lounging in the distance, some massive, others closer to Wilbur's size. The staff greeted us warmly, helped unload Wilbur's crate, and guided us to a spacious enclosure where he would spend his first few weeks, acclimating before being introduced to the larger herd. "This is your new home, buddy," I said, opening the crate. Wilbur didn't move at first. He sniffed the air cautiously, eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. When he finally stepped out, it was with tentative hooves on the fresh straw. I knelt beside him, stroking his back the way he liked. "It's okay. These people will take good care of you." As if understanding, he pressed his snout against my hand, then took a few steps forward, exploring. When he discovered a mud patch in the corner, his ears perked up. He looked back at me as if asking permission. "Go ahead," I laughed through tears I couldn't hold back. "That's all yours." Wilbur needed no further encouragement. He trotted to the mud, circled twice, then flopped down with a contented grunt that was almost a sigh of relief. It was time to say goodbye. The sanctuary staff assured us we could visit anytime, that they would send updates and photos. Wilbur was already focused on his mud bath, barely noticing as I lingered at the gate. "He'll be happy here," Sarah said, slipping her hand into mine. I nodded, unable to speak. As we turned to leave, I heard a familiar squeal. Wilbur had leapt up from his mud bath and was trotting toward the fence, leaving muddy hoof prints in his wake. He pressed his snout through the slats, eyes locked on mine. For a moment, time suspended. In those intelligent eyes, I saw recognition, affection, and something that might have been gratitude. A silent thank you from animal to rescuer. Then, with a final soft grunt, he turned and trotted back to his mud wallow. No longer the desperate, dying piglet I'd found, but a confident young pig embarking on his new life. We visit Wilbur once a month now. He's thriving, nearly 300 pounds, with a glossy coat and boundless energy. He has friends, a routine, caretakers who adore him. When we arrive, he still recognizes us, still comes running with that distinctive limp that never fully disappeared. Sometimes I drive home from those visits and find myself passing the spot where I found him, now just an ordinary patch of field. I think about how close he came to being just another statistic, one more casualty of industrial farming, forgotten before he had a chance to live. Instead, he changed my life. Taught me about resilience, about fighting against impossible odds, about how sometimes the smallest lives leave the biggest impact on our hearts. Not everyone can rescue a farm animal, of course. Not everyone has the space, resources, or time, but we can all do something. Support local animal sanctuaries, make more compassionate food choices, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Because every life, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, deserves a fighting chance. Just like Wilbur.